We were gathered in the atrium of Northbridge Advisory Group. Marble floors, soft jazz, executives pretending to listen while checking their phones. It was the annual leadership mixer, the kind of event where promotions were quietly decided long before anyone clapped. I had been told, very clearly, that this was my year. Instead, my boss cleared his throat and smiled. "I'm pleased to announce that our new Director of Strategic Operations will be Evan Holloway." Applause erupted. Evan, my boss's nephew. He stood up late, like he'd been woken from a nap, adjusted his blazer, and gave a lazy half-wave. He'd been at the company for 18 months, missed deadlines, delegated everything, took credit loudly, failed quietly. I didn't move, I didn't clap, I just stood there, glass still in my hand, feeling the familiar sensation of something clicking into place, because for 11 years, I had built that department. I was Tracy Cooper, senior strategy lead. I stabilized 3 failing client portfolios, increased retention by 40%, designed the forecasting framework Northbridge still used in every quarterly briefing. When crises hit, I stayed. When others burned out, I absorbed their work without complaint. Merit, I believed, still mattered. My boss caught my eye across the room. His smile tightened just slightly. Later, as conversations buzzed around us, he approached. "Tracy," he said casually, like this was a scheduling oversight, "I hope you understand. Evan brings fresh energy." Fresh energy. I nodded. Calm, professional. "Of course," I said. That night, I went home, opened my laptop, and finished drafting the document I had been quietly preparing for weeks. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't impulsive. It was precise. And the final sentence, just one line at the bottom, was something no one at Northbridge had bothered to imagine. Especially my boss. Especially Evan. Because by the time they noticed it, the promotion would be the least of their problems. How are you feeling right now? Angry? Disappointed? Or just quietly numb if this story stirred something in you? Try this tonight. Write one honest sentence about a moment you were overlooked. Then close the notebook and leave it there. It helps the weight settle without taking over. Where are you listening from right now? If this resonates, consider subscribing. There's more ahead. And the next part is where the consequences begin to surface. The week after the announcement moved faster than it should have. By Monday morning, Evan had already updated his email signature. Director of Strategic Operations, bold font, pronouns. A quote about leadership that sounded borrowed. He walked the floor with a confidence he hadn't earned, stopping at desks he'd never contributed to, offering advice no one had asked for. I watched quietly. That was my advantage. People assume silence means acceptance. They mistake professionalism for weakness. My calendar filled with meetings that no longer included me. Forecast reviews I had built, now owned by Evan. Client calls where my name was mentioned, like a footnote. Tracy used to handle this. Past tense. Already, on Wednesday, my boss called me into his office. Glass walls, door closed. That artificial calm executives use when they think they're being kind. "I want you to know," he said, folding his hands. "This wasn't a reflection of your performance. Of course it wasn't. It was about optics." He continued. "Leadership presence. Evan connects well." I nodded, took notes, let him finish. Then I slid a folder across his desk. "What's this?" he asked. "My formal resignation," I said. "Effective end of month." He blinked. Once, twice. "Tracy, let's not be dramatic." I didn't smile. "This includes my transition plan," I added. "Everything currently operating under my systems, along with a clarification regarding ownership and scope." He skimmed the first page, relaxed slightly. Then he reached the final paragraph. That's where his forehead tightened. "Wait," he said. "What do you mean, non-transferable strategic assets?" I leaned back. For 11 years, I designed and maintained proprietary workflows that were never codified into my employment contract, I said calmly. They were advisory contributions, not company property. That can't be right. It is, I replied. Legal confirmed it last quarter. You signed off on the review. Silence filled the room. Outside, I could hear Evan laughing too loudly near the break area. My boss swallowed. So, what happens now? Now, I said. Standing. Northbridge operates without my frameworks, forecasting, prioritization models, escalation logic, all of it sunsets with my departure. You're serious. I've never been more serious. That afternoon, emails started coming in, confused questions, missed triggers, a client asking why their dashboard looked different. By Friday, Evan scheduled an emergency team sync. He spoke for 20 minutes without saying anything useful. I watched from my desk, packing a box slowly, photos, a notebook, a pen I'd used for every major deal. As I walked out, my phone buzzed. A message from an unfamiliar number. This is Mark Delaney from Crestfall Consulting. We met briefly last year. Are you still open to a conversation? I smiled for the first time all week, because while Northbridge was scrambling to understand what they'd lost, someone else already knew exactly what I was worth. The first Monday after my resignation became official. I woke up later than usual. No alarms, no emergency emails, no calendar reminders demanding I fix something that had quietly been broken by someone else. I made coffee, sat by the window, and watched the city move without me. At Northbridge, the silence didn't last. By 9:30, my former team realized something was wrong. The automated prioritization board hadn't refreshed overnight. Client risk flags were frozen. My escalation queue was blank. Evan blamed the software. Probably a sync issue, he said during the morning stand-up, waving a hand like confidence could substitute for understanding. It's looking into it. It wasn't. Because the system didn't belong to them. By midday, my phone started lighting up not from leadership, but from analysts. Hey Tracy, do you know why the Q3 model isn't populating? This might be a dumb question, but the forecasting logic looks empty. Was there documentation we're missing? I answered none of them. Not out of spite, out of clarity. I had left a transition guide, 30 pages, clean, detailed. It explained what would stop working, not how to rebuild it. Because the how was never written down, it lived in my head. It always had. By Tuesday afternoon, the first client escalated, then another, then a third, Crestfall Consulting's biggest account, the one I personally stabilized 2 years earlier. They requested an urgent call. Evan joined it alone. He lasted 8 minutes. The client's tone shifted halfway through polite to cold. Questions became pointed. Timelines were challenged. Confidence eroded in real time. By the end of the call, the client asked one simple question. Is Tracy Cooper still advising your strategy team? Evan hesitated. No, he said. She's moved on. The line went quiet. I see, the client replied. Then we'll need to reconsider our position. That evening, my boss finally reached out. Tracy, can we talk just briefly? I stared at the message. I didn't reply, because earlier that day, I'd had my own meeting, Crestfall Consulting, small conference room. No glass walls, no posturing. Mark Delaney didn't waste time. We've been following your work for years, he said. Northbridge benefited from it longer than they deserved. He slid a folder across the table. Inside was an offer, not just a role, but autonomy, authority, ownership. Build it here, he said. Your way. I signed the letter that night, back at Northbridge. Panic was setting in. Meetings multiplied. Evan stayed late, searching for answers he didn't know how to ask. And my boss. He was finally reading the resignation document again. This time, slowly. This time, carefully. Because now, the final sentence didn't feel symbolic anymore. It felt expensive. The call came on a Thursday afternoon, 3 days later than it should have. I recognized the number immediately. Northbridge's main line, my boss's extension. I let it ring. Not out of bitterness. Out of accuracy. I was in the middle of a planning session at Crestfall whiteboard full. Momentum clean. Decisions being made without ego. Stopping that for a conversation rooted in regret would have been the wrong priority. He tried again an hour later. Then he emailed, "Tracy, this is important. Please call me." I finished the session, packed my bag, and walked home before replying. "I'm available for 15 minutes tomorrow at 9:45. He called at 9:46. His voice was different, careful, compressed, like someone choosing each word with tweezers. "Thank you for making time," he said. "I know things have been tense." "Tense is a feeling," I replied. "This is operational." A pause. "We're experiencing disruptions," he admitted. "The systems you built were more integrated than we realized." "I know," I said. "We'd like to discuss options. Options for what to bring your frameworks back. Even temporarily." I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. "You promoted Evan," I said evenly. "He's Director of Strategic Operations. That should cover it." Silence. "Tracy," he said, lowering his voice. "Let's be realistic." "I am," I replied. "You made a decision based on proximity, not performance. This is the result." He exhaled. "What would it take?" There it was. The question he'd been avoiding. "It would take acknowledgement," I said. "Public, internal, clear. We can't undermine leadership." "You already did," I replied. "You just picked the wrong one?" Another pause. "Longer this time. We can discuss compensation." "I'm not selling relief," I said. "I'm protecting what I built." He tried a softer approach then. Talked about loyalty, about history, about how surprised he was by my resignation. I listened without interrupting. Then I said, "You weren't surprised. You were comfortable. There's a difference." I could hear him swallow. "Tracy," he said quietly, "we misjudged?" "Yes." I agreed. "You did." I told him I'd consider a limited conversation, nothing more after my first month at Crestfall. No guarantees, no promises. When the call ended, I didn't feel victorious. I felt done. At Northbridge, Evan was unraveling. He scheduled workshops, brought in consultants who asked basic questions, tried to recreate models by copying old slide decks without understanding the logic underneath. People started leaving meetings early. Analysts stopped asking him for guidance. And in the break room, conversations lowered when he walked in. Meanwhile, Crestfall moved fast. By the end of my second week, we'd implemented the first phase of my system. Early indicators showed cleaner prioritization, faster turnaround, fewer escalations, no applause, just results. One evening, Mark stopped by my desk. "They're going to call again," he said. "I know." "Are you worried?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "They're finally catching up to a decision they made months ago. And this time, there would be no undo button. And this is where things get weird." By the third week, Northbridge stopped pretending everything was fine. Meetings were no longer optional, they were mandatory. Calendars filled with alignment sessions and rapid recalibration reviews. Evan chaired them all, armed with slides that looked impressive until someone asked a follow-up question. Then the room would stall. Someone would cough. Another person would glance at the clock. Decisions were being delayed because no one trusted the process anymore. I heard about it secondhand. A former teammate texted me late one evening. Nothing dramatic, just a single line, "We're doing twice the work for half the clarity." At Crestfall, the contrast was almost jarring. No theatrics, no grand announcements, just clean execution. My framework went live across 2 teams, then 4. Metrics stabilized. A client who had been hovering near churn renewed early quietly. Without negotiation, the work spoke for itself. That's when my boss called again. This time, it wasn't an ambush or a plea, It was measured. "We've reviewed your terms," he said. "The board wants to explore a formal acknowledgement and a short-term licensing discussion." I let the silence breathe. "And Evan?" I asked. Another pause. "He's struggling," he admitted. The role may have been premature. Premature was a generous word. "I won't undermine him," I said. "You already did that when you put him there." He didn't argue. We ended the call without agreement. No tension. No raised voices. Just the weight of consequences settling where they belonged. That night, I walked home through streets I'd rushed past for years. Storefront lights, reflections in glass. The feeling was unfamiliar space where pressure used to be. I realized something then. Quietly. Without ceremony. When you stay silent too long to be agreeable, someone else will speak loudly enough to replace you. That wasn't bitterness. It was calibration. At Northbridge, the cost of that silence was becoming visible. A senior analyst resigned. Another requested a transfer. Clients asked for reassurances leadership couldn't give without mentioning my name. At Crestfall, my calendar filled with work that mattered. Not because it was urgent, but because it was right. A week later, Mark forwarded me an article from an industry newsletter. No names. Just a line buried halfway down: "A major advisory firm faces internal restructuring after overestimating leadership readiness." I didn't smile. I didn't need to, because the lesson had already landed on both sides of the table. Promotions given for comfort eventually demand competence, and when competence has already walked away, the bill always comes due. Northbridge was learning that in real time, and I was done teaching it for free. The acknowledgement came sooner than I expected. Not a call, not an apology, a document. It was sent to me late Sunday night, attached to an email marked Board Review Draft. No greeting, no framing, just the file. I opened it slowly. Page 3, second paragraph. The operational forecasting and prioritization frameworks referenced in previous quarterly reports were originally designed, implemented, and maintained by Tracy Cooper during her tenure as Senior Strategy Lead. My name. In print. Plain. Undeniable. I sat with it for a moment, letting the weight settle. This wasn't generosity. It was survival. Northbridge had reached the stage where denial cost more than admission. Monday morning, the ripple effect began. Industry chats lit up. A former client forwarded the excerpt with a single line. "So it really was you." Another message followed from an analyst I hadn't spoken to in years. "Thank you for not letting them erase you." At Northbridge, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to quiet reckoning. Evan stopped leading meetings. He attended them instead. Silent, scribbling notes he didn't know how to use. His confidence hadn't collapsed, it had simply run out of air. Leadership scheduled an all-hands. My name came up 3 times. Not with praise, with clarification. They called it setting the record straight. Employees called it something else. That afternoon, my former boss called again. "This wasn't easy," he said. The board resisted. "I know," I replied. "They wanted to move forward quietly and pretend it fixed the problem." "Yes," he admitted. "You didn't leave us that option. That wasn't intentional. It was inevitable." We spoke briefly about licensing short-term. Limited scope. Tightly defined. Nothing permanent. Nothing that blurred ownership. I told him I'd review the proposal with Crestfall's legal team. After the call, I didn't feel relief. I felt alignment, because something important had happened, not just for me, but for everyone still inside that building. Here's the quiet truth no one says out loud when recognition is delayed long enough. It stops being motivational and starts being corrective. Northbridge wasn't honoring my work. They were correcting a narrative that had become too expensive to maintain. At Crestfall, no one made an announcement, no memo, no applause. Mark stopped by my desk with a printout. "Clients are asking for you by name," he said. "That's new." I nodded. Good, I said. Let's make sure they know where to find me. That evening, I updated my professional profile for the first time in years. Not to boast, just to reflect reality. Founder of a system, architect of a process, builder of outcomes, across the city. Northbridge was reorganizing titles, reassigning authority. Quietly undoing a decision they could never publicly admit was rooted in convenience. And Evan, he submitted a transfer request. No announcement, no farewell email, just absence. Which, I realized, was the most honest ending his promotion could have had. If you leave here, you will miss the most important thing. The licensing proposal arrived 2 days later. Clean, polished, carefully worded by people who understood contracts better than consequences. Northbridge wanted a 6-month license to my framework restricted use, internal only, no derivative rights. On paper, it looked reasonable, generous, even, the kind of offer meant to signal respect without surrendering control. I read it twice. Then I handed it to Crestfall's legal team without comment. What struck me wasn't what Northbridge asked for. It was what they avoided. No mention of rebuilding the culture that rewarded proximity over performance. No acknowledgement of the people who'd been sidelined after me. No plan to prevent the same mistake from happening again. They weren't fixing a system. They were patching a leak. Later that week, I met Mark for a walk after work. No agenda, just movement and air. They're trying to buy time, he said. I know. Does that bother you? I thought about it. About the nights I'd stayed late to stabilize accounts. About the meetings where my ideas were accepted, only after someone else repeated them louder. About Evan's promotion speech and the applause that followed. No, I said finally. It clarifies things. Because here was the truth I hadn't fully articulated yet. Some organizations don't change because they learn. They change because they can't afford not to, and that distinction mattered. At Northbridge, the repair effort was visible but clumsy. New committees formed. External advisors were brought in. A leadership readiness review was announced, carefully framed as proactive, not reactive. People weren't fooled. A former colleague told me morale was split down the middle, half relieved the truth was finally acknowledged, half exhausted by how long it had taken. They keep asking who owns what now, she said. No one wants to build something they can't protect. That was the real damage, not the lost frameworks, the lost trust. At Crestfall, momentum kept building. We onboarded a new client mid-size, complex, demanding. The kind of engagement Northbridge used to pride itself on. Within 2 weeks, our delivery timeline beat their expectations, not by pushing harder, but by structuring smarter. The client asked me one question during the review. What happens if you leave? I answered without hesitation. Then the system stays, I said, because it's documented, shared, and understood. That was the difference, back at Northbridge. They waited for my response. I sent it Friday afternoon. 6 months became 3. Scope tightened further. Attribution clauses added. No exclusivity, no future assumptions. My former boss replied with a single line. Understood. We'll proceed. No negotiation, no pushback. They were out of leverage. As I closed my laptop, I felt something settle, not satisfaction, not anger, closure. Because the lesson wasn't that I'd won. It was that I'd stopped paying the hidden cost of staying quiet in a system that thrived on it. And that was worth more than any license fee they could offer. The license went live quietly. No announcement, no internal celebration. Just a system reactivated under stricter boundaries. Watched carefully by people who now understood its value, too late to feel proud about it. At Northbridge, the change was immediate but incomplete. Workflows stabilized, client complaints slowed, meetings regained structure. But something intangible was missing. The confidence that used to carry decisions, the ease of momentum. People followed the process now, but they didn't trust it. Trust doesn't come back with access, it comes back with accountability. Evan cleared out his desk on a Tuesday afternoon. No send-off email, no farewell coffee, just a quiet exit through the side elevator. Word spread anyway, it always does. My former boss didn't call. He didn't need to. The story had finished telling itself. At Crestfall, we were preparing for a broader rollout, nothing flashy, just careful expansion. One team at a time. One promise kept before the next was made. During a planning review, Mark asked me a question he hadn't asked before. What would you do differently if you could rewind? I thought about it longer than I expected. I would have named my work earlier, I said. Not louder, just clearer. He nodded, like he understood exactly what I meant. Because here's the lesson that sat quietly beneath everything that happened, one I hadn't fully accepted until now. If you don't define the value of your work, someone else will define it for their convenience. I didn't dwell on it. Lessons are only useful if they don't slow you down. That afternoon, a message came through from a junior strategist I'd never met. She'd found my name through the acknowledgement, followed the thread to Crestfall, and took a risk reaching out. I saw what happened, she wrote. I'm trying to decide whether to stay quiet or speak up. I didn't give advice, I just replied. Make sure your work can stand without you, and that your name can stand with it. That evening, I walked home through streets that felt familiar again. Not rushed, not heavy, just present. Northbridge would survive. They always do. Institutions absorb mistakes by smoothing their edges and calling it resilience. But they wouldn't forget this one. Neither would the people who watched it unfold. And neither would I, because the final shift wasn't external. It was internal. I no longer waited for rooms to open for me. I built spaces that didn't need permission, and as Crestfall prepared to announce our next phase, I realized something quietly reassuring. The story wasn't about a promotion lost. It was about alignment found. And what came next wouldn't need correction. It would simply move forward clean, owned, and finally named. The industry noticed the shift before Northbridge admitted it. It started with invitations subtle at first. Panel discussions, private roundtables, strategy sessions labeled off the record. People didn't ask about the promotion anymore. They asked about the system, about the thinking behind it, about how it scaled without breaking the people using it. That's how I knew the narrative had changed. At Crestfall, we finalized the next expansion phase without ceremony. No countdown, no press release, just signatures and a clear path forward. The work grew heavier, but cleaner. More responsibility, less noise. One afternoon, a former Northbridge client requested a call. Not through the firm directly. I hope this isn't awkward, she said when we connected. It isn't, I replied. She didn't waste time. We stayed longer than we should have, she admitted. Not because the results were there, but because we trusted you. Trust. Spoken plainly, without leverage. I'm not asking you to leave them, she added. I just want to understand what it would look like if we followed the work instead of the logo. I told her the truth. It would look quieter, I said, but clearer. 2 weeks later, Crestfall signed its largest engagement to date, at Northbridge. The 6-month license began to feel like a countdown rather than a solution. Leadership tracked usage closely. No one wanted to be responsible for losing access again. The system worked, but only because it was handled carefully, like something borrowed, not owned. That distinction changed behavior. Meetings shortened, decisions slowed, risk tolerance dropped. People waited for confirmation instead of acting. Competence can be rented. Confidence cannot. My former boss sent one final message near the end of the quarter. I wish we had done things differently. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, but because the statement didn't require a reply. Regret without action is just reflection. At Crestfall, we held a review session with the core team, no slides, no hierarchy, just honest feedback. What worked? What didn't? What needed refinement? At the end, Mark looked around the table. This only works because no one here is invisible, he said. I felt that land. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I opened the old notebook I'd carried through Northbridge for years. Pages of ideas, diagrams, notes I'd never shared because I was waiting for the right moment. I closed it. Not because the ideas were obsolete, but because I no longer needed to store value in silence. Here's what I understood now, fully and without resentment. You can outgrow a place long before you leave it. And when you finally do, what endures isn't the title you lost, but the structure you built. Northbridge would continue. The industry would move on. New names would rise. But the work, the real work, had already chosen where it belonged. And so had I. The last thing I expected was peace. Not celebration, not victory, just a steady calm that didn't ask for witnesses. The license with Northbridge expired without drama. No extension request. No emergency call. By then, they had rebuilt enough to function carefully, cautiously, aware of what they'd nearly lost again. That awareness would linger longer than any framework I ever designed. At Crestfall, the work continued to deepen. Fewer meetings, better questions, teams that understood why they were building, not just what. My role expanded naturally, not upward, but outward. Influence without spectacle, responsibility without noise. One evening, after a long but satisfying day, I walked home slower than usual. The city lights reflected off windows like quiet punctuation marks. I thought about the woman I'd been when the promotion was announced, the version of me, still waiting for a room to validate her presence. I smiled at how far away she felt. Here's what I know now. In the simplest terms possible, when recognition comes late, it teaches you something early, that your work never needed permission to matter. Northbridge taught me what happens when comfort outranks competence. Crestfall taught me the opposite, that clarity creates momentum, and momentum sustains itself. I no longer chase titles. I build structures that don't collapse when I step away. I name my work as I go. I leave fewer things unsaid. And if someone else rises faster, louder, shinier, I let them. Because I've learned that progress doesn't announce itself. It shows up quietly, does the job well, and keeps moving. That's what I did. That's what I'll keep doing. And wherever this story finds you, whether you're standing still, overlooked, or right on the edge of a decision, you don't need permission to move forward. You only need to choose yourself once. After that, the rest tends to follow. I didn't lose a promotion, I gained clarity. Standing there, watching someone else take what I had earned, I felt the sting, the disbelief, the quiet question we all ask ourselves. Was it ever really about the work? What carried me forward wasn't anger, but the decision to stop shrinking my value for someone else's comfort. I learned that dignity grows when you choose yourself, that real worth doesn't vanish just because it's overlooked, and that walking away can be the most human, most powerful act of all. If you stayed with me until the end, thank you. What part of this story stayed with you the longest? And where are you listening from right now? If this resonated, share your thoughts in the comments. A like or share helps these stories reach someone who might need them today. And if you want more moments like this, subscribe and stay with us.